So let's have a quick look at some of the alternate camera rigs that you could use in your scenes. It's not always important to use an actual rig, especially if the camera isn't doing very much, but I'll show you the advantages and disadvantages of some of the alternate setups. Here I am inside my scene, and one common thing that you might want to do is just parent or target this camera to look at a specific object. So I'm going to do that by adding in an empty object. So just choose plane axis, and then I can choose this one here. Go over to the constraints, choose track 2, and then obviously just pick that empty that I've chosen there, and you'll notice that it's pointing in the wrong direction. So you'll need it to be in the negative Z to point towards that object, but it's gone red because our up can't be the same as our target angle, and for a camera the Y should be up. So now you can actually just grab this one object and move it around, and the camera is always going to point at that object. So that's it doesn't need to be an empty, it can be any object that you desire. Although if you do need to move the camera as well as the object, that's where you run into problems, because you'll have animation data on our empty object here, and you'll have animation data on this object, and they're two separate data blocks, and that will make it very difficult to edit and keep in sync. So if you need to move both of these objects, it's best to use a camera rig, so it's all contained into the one armature action. Now, another way might be to actually parent your camera to a path or a curve, and then have the camera follow along that path. So let's just quickly show you how to do that. I'm going to reset my cursor back to the middle, jump to the top view just because it's easier. I'm going to add in a curve. So I can choose any one of these curves, but for this example, I'm going to just choose path. And then when we jump into edit mode, you can see the arrows pointing in this direction, and that shows me the way that it wants to travel from this. It will be our start and this will be our end. If we want that to be opposite, we can just bring up the specials menu and then choose switch direction, and you'll see that those arrows are now pointed in the other way. Okay, so let's just give this a little bit of shape. It doesn't really matter, I'm just showing you how it works. If you choose a different type of curve, it will operate in whatever fashion that of the curve that you've chosen. So now it's time to parent our object to this curve. So let's just choose that one, and then shift select that, control P, and choose follow path. Now when we play our animation, you'll see that our camera moves along, although it's kind of offset. So let's reset that. We're going to hit Alt R to reset the rotation. Then we hit Alt G to reset the location, but you'll notice it's jumped to the origin of our curve and not the start. So let's actually clear the inverse parent. So let's hit Alt P to clear our parent, but we only want to clear the parent inverse. You'll notice that now it has snapped to the start of our curve. Now when we play our animation, the camera will follow along, although we don't have a lot of control. So you can rotate it if you want, but it makes it very difficult to animate. Plus, we can't easily control the speed or the direction of where it's going. To control the actual speed, we have to go over here and say, oh, okay, how long do we want it to go? Do we want this whole movement to be 100 frames, or do we want it to be 200 frames? What do we want it to be? Or if we want to manually manipulate it, we can actually just jump over into the graph editor here for our path, and then clear our modifier, which is what's automatically created. I'm just going to clear that, and then we're going to key our. Let's just add some keyframes. So on our evaluation time, I'm on frame 1. Then hit I, add it there, and let's just, for the sake of demonstration, let's go to frame 200, 201, and let's just type 201 here and hit insert. Now you'll see that it's going to slow, it has a nice slow start, and then it's going to speed up in the middle and then slow down at the end. So that's how we can get it to work like that. If we wanted to add extra keyframes and make it go backwards, we can do this. Let me just scrub and show you how it goes backwards. Woo! But then it just becomes really difficult to handle. And if we go behind negative, it's just going to go back to the start and sit there. So yeah, this becomes a very cumbersome way of working. Of course, you wouldn't do something as crazy as this, but I find it very difficult to manipulate this evaluation curve. So it's much easier just to use the camera rig in that situation. But if your camera is just going straight ahead along the curve, any type of curve, then this would be an excellent option. Today we're going to practice the tilt shift effect by doing two simple examples in this one demo. The first is going to be a bunch of arrayed cubes, which will replicate if you're working on a render of a tall building and you wanted the vertical lines to stay vertical while getting the entire thing in the frame. This is something you do quite a lot in an architectural render. But after that, I'll show you the same technique to manipulate the vanishing point with some extruded text. You'll also see a really cool trick when working with text as well. Now, you don't need to copy exactly what I'm doing for your exercise. Feel free to be creative and come up with your own example. You really can be as creative as you want. Anything that you do is fine as long as you effectively show how you have tilt shifted the perspective. Hopefully these two examples will give you some ideas on how you might use this effect in your own work. Okay, let's do this. So the first thing I'm going to do for this tutorial is not delete the default cube, because this is going to be the only tutorial in the history of Blender where I'm actually going to be using the default cube. Awesome. I am going to get rid of this default light though. So see you later light, get out of here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to shrink this down by hitting S and then type in 0.1 so that it is 20 centimeters across rather than 2 meters. And then I want to apply that scale. This is not totally necessary, but it's always a good habit to be getting into, because that returns the scale to 1. So we've applied that scale there. And let's split our view. So we've got one half of our screen showing what the camera is looking at. So let's go horizontal, horizontal split, bang, and then make this one the camera view there. Whoops, a daisy. I actually made the object the actual camera. So let's just fix that there. This is now the active camera. And I'm going to reset this and position it. So actually, I don't like the perspective view. I'm going to change it to orthographic. I find it a little bit easier to navigate through the scene in orthographic. And let's reset it. So Alt-R, Alt-G. And that's put it back at the 0, 0, 0. And the camera's pointing down. Let's move it back in this direction. Now, because I've already practiced this tutorial, I'm going to type in -1.5 because that is a good amount of distance for what I want to show. And then I want to rotate this one up. We're moving in the -90 degrees, which is actually +90 in our value here. So now we're trained on our cube. Now, because I want to show the changes in perspective, I'm going to shorten my camera lens to emphasize this perspective change. This is also one of those things that isn't totally necessary, but rather than using the 50mm lens, I'm going to use a short lens of a 16mm or a wide angle, as you've already learnt from the other videos, which is going to emphasize the perspective distortion. So here is our cube. I'm going to position it over here on the left of our camera. So that is in the, yep, that's in the X. And let's move it -1.4 meters to the left. And can you see the skewing or the stretching of the horizontal or the depth of the camera? That's what I mean by I want to emphasize this perspective. And now I want to use an array modifier to copy this across to the other side, and then another array modifier to make it go vertical. So let's go add modifier array. Let's go 9 copies across, and let's add some space. So we're using the relative offset here. Make this a little bit bigger. So the relative offset, we're going to make this 1.75. Yep, that will give us some nice space between our cubes here. And also it's going to make it nice and even on both sides of the camera. But you can use your own settings just as long as you're showing the tilt shift effect. So that is our horizontal. Let's add another copy of this to make our vertical. So we don't want it to copy across the X anymore. We want it to, so let's zero this out. We want it to be on the Z. And let's try 1.5. Yep, that's good. And we don't want 9 copies. Let's just go with 6 copies. So we've got 9 on the horizontal and 6 up. And now I just want to be a little bit fancy, but not super fancy. I want to use the random color and make each one of these cubes a random or a different color. But at the moment, they're all part of the same object because we're using these modifiers. So let's apply them. Go apply, apply. Now they're still part of the same object. So let's jump into edit mode and hit P. And I'm going to separate them all based on loose parts. And now you'll see when we jump back to object mode, these are all separate objects now, which is what we want. Although a nice thing to do is, at the moment, the origin points are all at this point here. It'd be nice if the origin points were with each one of these geometries. So let's go object, set origin, origin to geometry, and now we've got them all lined up. So that's pretty good. And while we have them all selected, it's always a good habit to get into to try and keep things nice and neat. So I'm going to create a collection for these. I'm going to hit M create a new collection, and let's just call it cubes, because later on I'm going to hide that and it's going to make it easy when they're all in the one collection. There we go. That's our cubes done. Now it's time for our perspective. So what I want to do is fill up our frame with all these cubes, but I don't want to lose the front perspective. So see how all these lines are converging away from our lens here, or actually now the vanishing point is somewhere up here, and we've got a second vanishing point along the ground. I want to keep that, but not have these lines pushing in here. So how do we do that? That is super duper easy. So I'll just undo that rotation. Actually, let me put my cursor to the origin point, or the world origin. So this is where my vanishing point is. You can see everything is kind of pointing towards this direction. But if I move my camera up to fill our frame, it's no longer pointing at this point. It's pointing at the center of the frame here. So let me undo that and add our tilt shift. So as you've learned, over here in the data tab is where our shift, X and Y. So this is our tilt shift. The X is the shift and the Y is the tilt. So let's just move this up. And 0.24 looks correct. So let's have a look at this. Yeah, it's nice and neat, meaning like our horizontals are still placed within the frame correctly, and our vanishing point is still down here at the cursor. So that's what we want. We're now ready to save this and render it. So let's go File, Save As. Actually, I'm going to call this Tilt Shift Exercise Cubes. Saved, and we're ready to render. So now I want to go to View and just render out the viewport rather than rendering out a real render. It's got my final result here. I got my cubes with my tilt shift effect applied. All right, so that is the first demo that I wanted to do. Now let's move on to the next exercise. All right, so let's do a similar thing, but messing around with some typography. So with my nice little handy collection here, I'm just going to hide this because we don't need it for this exercise. And then I'm going to reset my camera. So we're starting with a blank slate. So make sure that our tilt shift is back to 0, 0. Then we're going to jump to front view and add in some text. So Shift A, add text. I'm going to change this to be aligned with the world over to view. So now we've got our text facing us, and let's jump into edit mode. So tab edit, and let's give it some text. I'm going to type in tilt shift, and then hit not enter, tab, jump out to object mode. All right, let's change our font. So over here in the data tab, we're going to first of all move it to the center. So we've got it nice and lined up there. And let's go to the font. And this is regular font, so I'm just going to load up my fonts library. Now, how did I go straight to the fonts? Here's a little bit of a tip for everyone. If you jump to your preferences and go to the file paths, and you put in your fonts directory here and save your preferences, then you don't need to navigate to it every time. So I always forget where it is on my system, and I just got sick of having to do that however many times. Not that I use text all that often, but now I want to hit that, it's going to open up that location, which makes it really handy. So what is my font? It is Snow. I don't know how to say that properly. And there we go. So that is my text. So now what I want to do is let's extrude it a little bit. So let's go up to the geometry here. And we want to extrude it. You can see it's coming towards the camera, and that's not what I want. It'd be nice if I can get it to stay here as I adjust this extrude value. Well, I can get it to do that, and it's really, really easy to do. I'm going to add a simple driver from the extrude value and paste it onto our Y location here. So on our extrude, let's go right click, copy as new driver, then over here, right click and go paste driver. And now when we change this, you can see the front is staying on the 0. That is really, really handy. So good work, Wayne. So now what I want to do is play around with the tilt. So at the moment, you can see our cursor is still in the middle. See, all the letters are, their vanishing point is to this point here. Now this might be what you want, but what if you wanted this a little bit lower on the screen, right? So you'd move your camera up, and you move your camera up. This is where I want my text, but now the vanishing point is here and everything is kind of skewed back there. So that's not going to work for us. We can actually use the tilt shift. So what I'm going to do is let's get our perspective looking correct. So I want to make it look like, don't worry about it going off. I want really long perspective here, and actually let's make it even longer. Something like let's go, yeah, 4 meters. Let's go 4 meters back. That's something that I want. But now you can see it is off the screen. We want it on the screen. So let's use our tilt. Let's go Y, move it down. Let's go all the way down, so further. Something like that. So you can see it looks like our text is coming from the bottom, right in the middle of our frame here. Actually, let's make it in the dead center. Something like that looks good. And because this isn't going all the way out, let's make it even further. Look at that. 100 meters. Craziness. Let's go 150 meters. Can my view actually see that far? Yeah, it can see 1,000 meters. So this is good. I want to render this. So let's go viewport, render image, tilt shift. Oh. Although let's get rid of all the overlays and stuff. Let's also make it transparent. So let's go to film, transparent here. Let's try that again. Let's go view. Let's save this. Go image, save as, tilt shift, text. We are done. And there we have it. 2 examples of the tilt shift effect. Some cubes that stay straight and some extruded text. That was fun. And you can see here, I've also animated this to make it even more fun. Hopefully you've learned something, but I'm really looking forward to seeing your submission. Thanks for watching. In this lesson, we're going to practice a simple yet fun rack focus. Like the other exercises, you do not need to copy exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to include this file as a starting point for you if you are one of those lazy people that we sometimes hear about, but feel free to create your own example for this one. Here's a similar thing done with a couple of monkey heads. You can do what you like as long as you're showing the rack focus effect. Let's go. So here is that file that you saw in the intro there. So I'm doing a little bit of a perspective cheat. I've got a really big rack, which is far away, and I've got a really small focus, which is front. So that's how I'm getting the depth perception there. You can use whatever objects that you want for this exercise, just as long as you're showing the rack focus effect. Okay, so this camera is just a normal camera. There's nothing special about it. There is no camera rig or anything like that. I'm just going to do the animation with this this normal camera. All right, so we're ready to start our animation. So I'm going to go over to our data tab. You can see I'm on a perspective camera, 50 millimeters, so that's all default. I'm going to enable my limits. So under the viewport display, turn on your limits. So this is going to give me my depth of field, the distance. And then down a little bit further, I'm going to enable our depth of field. So this is going to activate it. And in our viewport up here, I want to just make sure that we can actually see our depth of field. So I'm going to turn it on in our viewport. You can see nothing much is happening at the moment, but we'll deal with that later. It's also, just so that you're aware, the depth of field works better with cycles. It's more accurate than if you use the Eevee render. But when you're looking through the viewport, it's actually using the Eevee renderer anyway. So what you see in the viewport isn't going to be exactly what you get in the output if you're using the cycles. So because I'll be using cycles for the final render, just use the Eevee as kind of a guide. Right, hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to start animating our camera now. So in the camera data, let's turn on our distance. Actually, I'm going to jump to the top view. I can actually just left click and drag this one and position it, and that's giving me the distance there. So I don't need it to be pointing straight at it. I'm looking at the perpendicular line that's coming off here from the main one. And as I mentioned earlier in the course, I'm using this depth of field utilities little add-on. Now you don't need to use it, but it's just going to help us visualize what's going on a little bit better. So I'm just going to disable that and enable it again, and you can see I've got my green lines here. So I'm going to lower down the f-stop number, which is the same thing as over here. So I think I'm just going to drag it and see what is our value. I don't want to go too much. So this, remember, this is actually just a guide. You can see how blurry this is, but it'll be nothing like that when you do the final render. I'm looking at how far our green bit is going, and I want the whole word to be in focus. So 0.3 is a little bit too much. Just make it a little bit bigger. Actually, 0.4 looks about right. It looks like it's got all of it. Although I don't need to worry about the back section here because it's behind. That's looking good. So time to keyframe. So I'm going to keyframe our distance by hitting I. keyframe our f-stop by hitting I. And then I'm going to jump to, because I want it to hold for a good amount of time, I'm going to say 20 frames later. So on frame 21, I'm going to keyframe that again. So I and I. Now I'm going to do my rack focus over, let's make it nice and easy. Let's do it 20 frames later. And this is where we're going to change. So I'm going to move this to our focal point here. Now I'm going to do that same trick. So I'm going to drag it here and click so that it is there. But we need to change our depth of field because I want to fill this whole thing in. So we need to actually make the f-stop bigger. Bigger means more in focus. So what do we want here? Maybe, do we want the whole thing? Maybe let's go 1.5. That looks about right. And then make sure that we key that. So key. And then we want to hold this. Let's do the same thing. We're going to hold it for 20 frames. So Shift D, duplicate. And then we want to go back to the default. So on frame 81, yep. And then just grab this keyframe here and then drag it over here. Let's see how it looks in our field of view. There we go. We've got our rack focus going on. Super duper easy. Now, if we were going to render this one, so if you just do a viewport render, I'll just go like this frame here. I'll just show you what I mean. So viewport render is going to look like our viewport up here. But if we do an actual real render, and I'll just fast forward that while our render is happening, through the powers of editing, that only took a second. So that is going to be our final result there. But obviously we're going to render the entire animation rather than just the one frame. There you have it, a nice, quick and easy rack focus. Now that you know how to do this, use it wisely. In this exercise, we're going to take this and turn it into this. Smash! We'll be emphasizing the impact of the ball by adding a little bit of camera shake. Let's see it again. Before and after. It's subtle, but it adds a lot. Now I'll be starting with a pre-baked physics and a pre-animated ball so we can just focus on the camera work. Now it is possible to do something like this with curve modifiers, but because the shake is only happening over a very short amount of time, it's going to be more hassle than it's worth to actually use the modifiers. So we're going to hand animate this. We'll be using the modifiers in another example. All right, let's get to smashing things. So here's the file that we're going to start with. For this exercise, all I want you to do is focus on the animation of the camera and making it bounce or rattle. And so I've given you this starting frame where I've already gone ahead and baked some physics. So let's just play it. You can see it smashing here. So let me just explain the file and how it's set up so you don't get lost. And then we'll go ahead and animate our camera here. So looking up here in the outliner, we have a few collections. We've got multi-ball. This is the actual rig and the geometry of our bowling ball here. So this is a free rig that I've made available. It's CC0, so you can do what you like with it. It is local to the file, but you can also download it separately on CG Cookie. So I've already gone ahead and animated this, so you don't need to worry about the animation of the ball. Although I will set you up a challenge if you've already done the animation bootcamp. Why don't you go ahead and animate your own bouncing ball or bowling ball or whatever you want to smash into the ground. You already know how to do this. Okay, so that is that one there. Then we have our camera, which is a dolly rig. I've already set it up so it's framed nicely. Now I've added it exactly the same way that I have in any of the other tutorials where I've used the camera rig. But as I said, I've just trained it on where I want. So it's about 1/3 of the way down, which is a nice spot for the impact. Then down here we have our background layer, which has the ground inner and ground outer. So what are these things? The ground outer is kind of this box that contains the inner, and the inner is the part that's going to smash, although I'm doing a geometry swap. So this is like an intact version of the geometry, and then I'm just animating it on frame 12 and swapping it for all the fracture parts here. So you can see this has got yellow on the inner, and all I'm doing is animating this value. So it has its own animation action called ground switch main. Now I'm just going to temporarily turn that off for when we're working so it doesn't distract us. So I'm going to scrub before frame 12, and then with the dope sheet open or the action editor open with the ground switch main, I'm going to just mute those channels. So now it's not going to disappear. And you can see when we go past this, we've got some kind of Z fighting here. So down here, this is the collection that holds all of those shard pieces, and I'm also animating them on. And so basically on frame 12, this ground inner turns off and all these shards turn on, but I'm just going to disable them for now because they're going to get in our way while we just work on our animation like this. So that should help you out. Just make sure that you mute this ground switch main while we're working, and then we'll unmute it for our final result. So I'm going to start animating the camera. Now I'm going to jump to the side view. Actually, I'll turn on my screencast keys, disable, enable. Here we go. So I'm going to jump into pose mode for this guy and turn on what keying set that I'm going to use. I'm going to use whole character, selected bones only. And I'm also going to make sure that this is enabled. And I have my auto keying turned on. I'm going to select all my bones and then hit I. So I've got a keyframe on, whoops, I should have been on frame 1. So let me just move that to frame 1. And then I'm going to just select the parts that I want. So before I do any more animation, what I want to do is think about what this camera is actually mounted on. So it is going to be mounted on, in my mind, it's mounted on a tripod, something like that. And so when the ball hits, I want it to kind of bounce up and down. So it's going to go in that direction. And it's also going to have a tiny little bit of rotation. Now the rotation, I'm going to animate on the aim control over here. So this is the one that I'm going to animate the rotation on, just by translating that up and down. But the up and down bounce, I'm going to be animating on this root control. So that is where I'm going to start with. Let me just hide those annotations and switch back to my tool here. So I'm going to do that on the Z channel, the up and down. So actually, let me bring up my manipulator here. So on frame 12 is the impact. I'm going to keyframe it there. So hit I. Then one frame later, I want it to bounce straight up. So I'm just going to drag it up there a little bit. So I'm not worried about this value now. I can tweak that in the graph editor later. That is one frame later. And then I want to go 2 frames later. Now I'm guessing here because I don't want the bounce or the rattle to go for too long. If it goes for too long, it's going to look really weird. If it goes for too short, it's going to just look jittery and it's not going to feel right. So I'm guessing that it's going to be somewhere between 8 and 10 frames. So I'm just, I'm going to go 1 frame later and keyframe it, and then keyframe it 2 frames later on the down. So this one is up, 2 frames later, I'm going to go down. So a little bit below, well, actually I can't see, jump to the side view, a little bit below where it started. 2 frames later, a little bit above, and then 2 frames later, I'm going to reset it back to default by hitting Alt-G, and that's automatically going to keyframe it there. So let's have a look at what we've done, actually, and then watch up here as well. Here's a little tip for you. Because I've got like 120 frames of simulation, and I don't want to loop it that often, I'm going to hit P down here, and then just select the frame range that I want to preview. So let's just go 30 frames. Now when I hit play to loop, it's only going to loop over that section. Okay, so I'm watching this, so that bounce is pretty good, although it's probably not big enough on our screen here, so I'm going to tweak that. So over here, I'm going to change this to the graph editor, Control Tab, and then hide everything except my Z location. At the moment, these are all Bezier curves, so I'm going to select them and hit V and make them vector, so it's going to make it a little bit more jagged, which is kind of what I want for a rattle type bounce. So this has already made it a little bit more or bigger here, but I'm going to go slightly bigger on this one here. So let's just go up a little bit, play that. Does that feel right? I'm looking at the screen and trying to feel the impact, and yeah, it's looking okay. I'll push it a little bit further in this down and this up. Okay, so let's. Yeah, that's actually, it's feeling like it's got more weight. Just going to make this screen big. Yep, feels heavier. So that's good. Now I'm going to work on the up and down rotation. So I'm going to do that on frame 12. I'm going to keyframe, because I've already keyframed the first position. I'm just going to hit I. And actually I've noticed that I've got some default values on here that I didn't want. So I don't want any rotation, because otherwise that's going to rotate like that. And I didn't mean to position it on the X and the Y, so I'm just going to clear that, and then I will delete this key and start again. So let's keyframe it here on the impact, hit I. And now with the bounce, I went 1 frame later, but on this control, I'm just going to do it every 2 frames, and then maybe at the end, I'll tweak it and make it a little bit faster. That'll make sense in a moment. So 2 frames later, I'm going to keyframe, and this one, I want to go in the same direction. Actually, yeah, I want to go up, and 2 frames later, I want to go down. 2 frames later, I want to go up. Now, I'm not too worried about the values at the moment because I'm going to get in the graph editor in a moment and fix it. That is up, down, up, and then I'm going to go 2 frames later and then position it back where we started. Now the ending, so Control D, put that here. So these 2 keyframes here, between 18 and 20, I'm going to deal with in the graph editor. So I'm not sure if that's the way that I want it. Let's have a look at it so far. Yeah, I've really emphasized that bounce. It's not quite doing what I want, and it's way too big. So let me just make this graph editor a little bit bigger and shrink this. And let's just hide everything except our Z location. So I'm going to select all of them and do the same trick by hitting V and making them vector. So that's going to make it straight and more jagged. And now I'm going to tweak the values. So I want it to go up, but I think this is too big, so I'm going to lower it down. And then this one here is too big as well. So this is my starting point. I'll just hit Control G to get the blue line along there. So this is kind of where my default point is. So it's gone quite up and then a little bit down. So I want that to go a little bit further down. This one, not so much. And let's tweak the end here. Just looking at it, I actually think that what I might try and do is just grab this and I will shift it back. So there's only 1 frame here. So now the start is fast and then it gets slower. Okay, and I think this one here is way too big as well. So what I'm going to do is just drag it down closer to that value along here. Let me just put my blue line there again, closer to that value. And I want this one to actually be Bezier. So I'm just going to hit auto clamped. It's going to smooth nicely into that final position. Okay, one final thing that I'm going to do to emphasize the impact. I have this actually starting 1 frame. It moves 1 frame after the impact, but now I'm going to move everything 1 frame forward so that it moves on the same frame that the ball hits the ground. And this is going to emphasize it a little bit more. So let me jump into the action editor here and just grab the keyframes that I want. So that is all this stuff. And then just drag it back 1 frame. Let's see how, yeah, that's looking much better. So I'll just show you what I mean. So here you can see this is the contact frame and our camera moves on that same frame. Now in reality, there'd be a little bit of a lag by the time that the vibration got to it, but in animation we can emphasize it the way that we want. I think that's made it a lot better. So I'm happy with how it's looking at the moment. So if I wasn't doing a tutorial, I'd spend a little bit more time tweaking the animation curves, but no one wants to watch that. So let me just turn everything back on and get it back to the way that we want for our final render. So I've just re-enabled our fracture layer here, and I'm going to select to jump into object mode, select our ground inner here. We still have our action strip here, and I'm just going to enable both those channels so it disappears, and now we should see it smash. Okay, and finally, let's disable our preview range here just by clicking this or hitting Alt-P in here. I'm just going to click the stopwatch there. And this is our final result. So there we go, some nice subtle animation on the root and the aim control here, just to add extra weight and impact to this ball hitting the ground here. So hopefully you've learned something and had a little bit of fun. I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. Today, we're going to be animating a handheld camera. It's actually quite difficult to hand key this type of motion, but thankfully we can use Blender's curve modifiers, which will make this super easy. Now I've only animated 2 controls in this example, and I'm actually letting the computer do most of the work. Curve modifiers are great for this type of thing. Plus, they work non-destructively over the top of your hand-keyed animation as well, if you want. Now, feel free to follow along with the provided file or animate your own example. Either way is fine. All I'm asking for this exercise is that you show the handheld camera effect. Now, subtlety is key. I've probably gone a little bit too big here, but that was to emphasize the movement for the sake of the tutorial. Sure, Wayne, that's exactly why I did it. Anyway, hopefully I will teach you a few new tricks, so let's get animating. Here is our starting file that you saw the example of in the intro there. Now, as I said, you don't actually need to use the same example as me. As long as you're showing the handheld camera effect, you can point that camera at anything, but this is the file that I am providing. All right, so let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in a camera rig, the dolly camera rig. So I'm actually using the Blender 2.90 because I've got the updated version of these camera rigs, and it just has this extra control here, the offset control, which is where I'm going to do most of the actual animation from. And if you don't have it, if you're using the old version of Blender or Blender 2.83 or previous, you have to do it over 2 controls. You have to animate this one kind of jiggling about a little bit as well as rotating, and then you'll have to do the up and down on this control. But in this example that I'm going to show you today, I've added that extra little control so you can do it all in the one. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to grab our main camera control and this one here, and I'm just going to move it back in the -10 along the y-axis, just so that our aim control is going to be pointed at our monkey head here. Then I'll change our camera view to look through here, and you can see this is what we're looking at. And I just want to move this down a little bit so that we're pointing dead center. Dead center is okay for this type of thing. Okay, and I'll also turn on my screencast keys because they've turned themselves off again. All right, so now we're actually ready to start keyframing our animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is keyframe the main movement on this main camera control. And so I'm going to turn on my keying for location and make sure that this is on, and then set auto keying on. So I want it to be maybe a little bit further back here on frame 1. And then I'm going to go to frame 101, so 100 frames later, and I'm still in top view, and I'm going to position it somewhere around here. So let's just scrub that. So yeah, that's kind of the thing that I want there. Although if I turn on my motion paths, I'm just hitting W. Although if you're using left click select, you have to push the right mouse button and then choose calculate bone paths. You can see this is traveling in a straight line. So let's fix that. I want to emulate a person kind of holding a smartphone and then kind of trying to walk in an arc, not quite going in a perfect circle, but more going in an arc. I'll change my graph editor over here. I'll shrink that down. It's in the way. Just hit the N key to shrink it down there. And it is actually the X channel that we want to manipulate. So I'm going to here. I'm just going to, whoops. I'm going to make sure that we're on individual centers. I'm going to rotate this one around. So it's pointing kind of straight up. And this one I'm going to drag out a little bit. Now I'm going to recalculate. So go W, recalculate, and you'll see it's now arcing. So that's actually what I wanted. That's good. That's done the arc. So the next thing I'm going to work on is our actual rotation on our controller. Let me change this to normal or local. I'm going to, whoops, not the main control, but the actual camera offset control is the one that we're going to be using. So I'm going to start with the X, which is the up and down rotation. I'm going to work on all the 3 rotations at first, and then I'll come back and do the offset on the translation. So let's go back to frame 1 and keyframe our location and rotation. So I'm just going to hit I and I. I also need to make sure that I change my keying set because I'm working with location and rotation. Actually, it doesn't really matter for this one because I'm only going to set 1 keyframe, and the rest I'm going to do with the modifiers. So I have a keyframe on frame 1. I'm going to start with our X channel here for our rotation, but I'll add these modifiers all at the same time. So I'm going to select this one, select this one, and select this one. Now to add a modifier, you can actually just bring up our little tab here. I'll make this one larger. You can actually go down to the modifiers tab and then go click add noise, but you have to do that for every single one that you have selected. But that's a little bit cumbersome. A quicker way of doing it is with those selected, if you hit Control Shift M, and then you can bring up whatever modifier that you like. And I'm going to choose the noise modifier. And you can see if I play this, it's going to go absolutely crazy. So this is not what we want. We don't want to be in the middle of an earthquake. We want to be very, very subtle with this one to make it look like someone's trying to do their best to hold it steady, but they're not quite getting it. So I'm going to actually, these wrench icon here, these actually mute these modifiers. So I'm just going to mute them for now and then work on one at a time. So I go back to the X, which is the kind of the up and down. You can see it's going way too big there. So I'm going to lower it down by increasing the scale, which makes it happen over a longer time. So I'm going to go somewhere about 10 will be fine. Was that 10.1? Let's play that. So that's it's still too big, but the speed at which it's happening and changing directions is kind of much better. So let's lower our strength now. So let's lower it down really, really little to, actually, I've gone too far. I'm going to type in, let's try 0.1. So, okay, that's good. It's still a little bit much, so let's actually halve that again, so 0.05. Yep, that's looking much better. And actually, let's just lower this a little bit more. So let's go a scale of maybe 12. Aha, cool. So that's looking much more natural, although at the start, these ones are a bit big. So what I might do is let's use the restrict frame range and start it at frame 1, and we want to go to, let's go to about frame 100, and then let's blend it in. So let's blend it in over say 24 frames, 1 second, and that way it's given it a much smoother intro. And let's blend it out as well on 24. I said 24 seconds, but I meant 24 frames, which is 1 second. There we go. Our up and down is looking much more natural. Let's move on. So we're going to the Y Euler channel. If we unmute that, we'll see what's going on. We want this one to be super subtle, super subtle. So let's change our scale here. Let's drag this up to maybe 15 or 16. Let's try 16. We'll see how we're going. Okay, that's a good speed at which it's happening, but it's still, the strength is way too much. And let's drag this all the way down. So it's easier to type. I'm going to try 0, actually just 0.3. Is that too subtle? Maybe it is. Just bump it up. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. So 0.05 is a decent value there. So now it's looking, yep, it's looking more handheld. And keep going on this. So let's turn our wrench icon on for the Z channel, and let's lower this one down, or actually increase the scale. So let's lower down 0.5 on the strength just for now, so I can see what's going on. So this is way too big. So let's increase the speed a little bit. So maybe somewhere around there. Yep. And now let's lower the amount. Okay, 0.1. That's still really big. So I'm going to use, I could lower the strength even more, but I'm going to show you what the influence does. So the influence actually is kind of like turning it on and off. So it's the same thing as multiplying by the strength. So I'm just going to lower this one down as well. Maybe let's go 40% of what it is. Which is good. Actually, let's go a little bit smaller. Let's go 20%. Really subtle. So there we go. That's looking pretty good. And now, because I've done our 3 rotations, I'm going to work on our translations now. So I kind of want to make this person look like they're walking. So I actually want to do the steps, which is the Z up and down. But I'm not actually going to use the modifier for that. I'm going to hand key it. So let's hide everything except that one channel. And this one, I'm going to left click and add some keyframes in here. So click, 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 click. Now let's check that out, see if it's too much. A little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is just select everything. Make sure that we're on automatic, so that we get some nice overshoots there. Actually, most of the time you don't want those type of overshoots, but for this, I think it's going to be good. It's going to simulate someone actually trying to do their best to hold the camera while they're walking, but not succeeding all the time. Yeah, it's still a little bit much, so I'm going to scale it down, but I'll scale around this first key here. So I'm going to select it and then hit Control G to make our 2D cursor at that point. And then I'm going to hit period, make sure that we're scaling around the 2D cursor, and then I'm going to scale this all down on the Y-axis. So let's go scale Y, and then let's go maybe 50% of what it was. So I'm going to hit 0.5 and then hit enter, and then okay, so it's still a bit too much, but I'm going to change this by hand. So it's probably this one here. Whoops, lower that one. So yeah, this change. And this one here is a little bit big. Whoops. Let's just move that around. And these ones are, the steps, are they too big? Maybe this one here. All right. I think it's still probably a little bit too overdone. So I'm just looking at the whole thing. Maybe not the ups and downs are overdone. Maybe it's the rotation. I think it's the rotation on the X. Sorry, the X one here. So yeah, it's this one. So I'm going to lower this one down. Let's use the let's lower the strength. I was going to say let's lower the influence, but let's do it on the strength. So rather than 5% strength, let's go 3% strength, and we'll see. No, let's offset this phase just to give us a different random value. So I'm looking for one that's not so, yep. There we go. So they're kind of similar height rather than one being really large. There we go. I'm kind of happy with that. That does look like someone's trying to do their best to hold their camera still and not doing the best job at it, but they're doing okay. So I'm going to turn off my overlays and let's use the render out the viewport here. We're not worried about a super duper fancy render. So let's go File. Actually, let's make sure that let's output it to a video. So handheld camera exercise.mp4. Let's click this one here, make it FFmpeg, and then choose MP4. And let's just do a viewport render. So viewport render animation. Let's look at that. So I think it's probably a little bit too big in a few spots. So I will probably go back and just tweak those so it's not so large. But overall, it looks like a handheld camera. So that is the end of the tutorial. Hopefully you learned something about the curve modifiers or the noise modifier, and have lots of fun, and I'll see your submissions on the site. While motion blur in the real world is a phenomenon related to the type of camera or the camera settings, in 3D, it's something that is edging towards the area of rendering and or compositing, which is outside the scope of this course. So in this lesson, I'll just give you a quick overview of this topic. Just think of it like an explainer rather than a follow-along tutorial. First, let's look at the real world and answer some of those questions. What is motion blur? In a real camera, there is a shutter that opens and closes that allows or blocks light from hitting the sensor. Now, if the subject of the camera is moving while the light is being captured by the sensor, the image will be blurred. And the longer the shutter is open or the faster the movement, the more the image will be blurred. Now, adjusting the speed of the shutter in the real world will mean that the camera operator needs to adjust some other settings to get the correct exposure. Although when we're in 3D, we don't need to worry about that stuff, as you've already learned. Now let's look at some of the actual types of shutters. In the old school days of film, we had what's called a rotary shutter. This is a shutter that would spin and block the light as it spins around. Here is a 180-degree shutter, which means that the film would have been exposed for half of the time of the frame rate. But this shape here would be greater than or less than 180 degrees to block out more or less light. And this would in turn increase or decrease the exposure time. Now the global shutter is where all the pixels of the sensor are active and then shut off at the same time. So it's kind of like an on and an off switch. So it's on for a certain amount of time and then it turns off. This is the default behavior of the Blender camera. Then we also have the rolling shutter. This is a shutter that scans from the top to the bottom, and this can have some weird effects for some images. This occurs because of the type of movement that is happening while the shutter is open. Let's have a look at this GIF from Wikipedia. You can see that the spinning rotor gets warped weirdly, but the linear motion of the car gets skewed in the direction that the motion is moving. All right, so let's talk about Blender. How does this all fit in? In Blender, there's actually two ways to achieve motion blur. There is at render time, which I'll call in camera, just for the lack of a better term right now. And then we have post rendering, which we do that in compositing. Here I have just a cube going backwards and forwards, moving pretty fast just to create some motion blur. Now over here in our render settings, I'm using the Cycles engine, but down here we have the motion blur tab. Now at the moment, this is only available in Cycles, but I've got some good news for the Eevee users in a moment. So this is what I call the in-camera settings. So if you enable this, basically the blur will happen at render time. Just doing a little bit of imagination and visualization up here. So this is all the information from our scene. It's just going straight into our output up here, even though I'm technically not using the compositor for this. It will use our motion blur settings from down here and then encode that directly into the image. I'll go over these settings in just a moment, but I'll show you the other way. If we enable the vector pass, we can actually do a vector blur and separate it out or do it in the actual compositing. So I'm just going to jump over here into our render layers, but you'll notice that our vector pass is grayed out, and that is because we can't have them both enabled at the same time. So you need to turn this off, and then when we jump back, you'll see that that is no longer gray. We can actually enable it or disable it. So to split it out, we would then connect our image to a vector blur node, our depth to the Z, so it knows the distance from the camera. And this vector pass is all the information about where the cube is actually moving, the direction and the speed. So we plug that into our blur node and then we output it there. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of both? Well, if we just connect this straight into here and use the in-camera settings, because we're using the Cycles engine, it will be quite accurate, but the more something is blurred, it actually is going to increase your render time. Plus, if you need to change or adjust your blur settings, then you kind of have to render the whole thing again. Whereas if we do it this way, where we pass it through the vector blur node, if we save it out in a clever way, we can actually adjust it after the fact without having to render out a whole entire animation over again. We can also adjust the settings, as I said. So each of the different ways has their advantages and disadvantages. So now let's actually take a look at the motion blur or the in-camera settings. We actually have our position here of our blur. We have three options. We have start on frame, center on frame, and end on frame. The default behavior is center on frame. Here we have the rendered image with the blur. An actual cube is in this position. You can see it's blurring behind and ahead. Whereas the start on the frame will look like this, and the end on frame will look like this. Okay, now the shutter speed is actually a percentage of the frame rate. So in this example, I'm at 24 frames per second. So this shutter speed is actually half of that. So it will be open for half of the time of the frame rate. So that will be 1/48th of a second. But you really don't need to think about this as it's 1/48th or any type of fraction like that. You can think about it as just lowering this down. So it's open for less time, we'll have less blur, or increasing it, we'll have more blur. You can't go over 1, which is the exposure for the entire length of the frame. And here is where we get our rolling shutter effect. So we change this to top to bottom, and it will scan from the top to the bottom. So the shutter speed is still how long it is exposed for, and the rolling shutter duration is how long it will take to get from the top to the bottom. You can see here the rolling shutter effect on our cube. You can see it's skewed exactly like the car. So let's try and recap how we can get motion blur into our renders. We've got our two render engines inside Blender. We have Cycles and we have Eevee. Now the Cycles rendering engine is ray trace based, which means it's highly accurate but a lot slower. And the Eevee rendering is real time, which means it's super fast. However, when we're working with motion blur, Cycles has the in-camera effect as well as the vector pass. And at the time of this recording, Eevee doesn't have either of those. However, there is a workaround to use vector information from Cycles renderer and composite that into your Eevee render. This is actually outside the scope of this course, but Ken Trammell shows you how to do exactly that thing in one of our other courses. I'll provide the link in the description. But as I alluded to before, the in-camera motion blur for Eevee is coming soon. Let's take a quick sneak peek at those settings, but I won't go into detail because it isn't released yet, and I'm sure we'll do a proper video of it once it is released. So here I am in the latest 2.9 alpha release, and you can see I can change over to the Eevee, and I have this motion blur tab. So here are the settings at the moment. We can't go over them in detail, as I said, because they're still in development and this isn't the final result yet. But you have the shutter speed, as well as background separation, max blur, and the steps. But I'm sure one of the other instructors will go over this in detail as soon as it is available. So that's something to look forward to now. So that's it for this overview. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about motion blur. Now, before I send you off into the wild world and you start making your own short films with all the information that you've learned in this course, there's just a few more helpful tips that I'd like to pass along to you. So this section I'm going to call practical tips. So the first tip is it's always a good idea to thumbnail or plan out what you're going to do before you actually do it. It's much easier to do it on pencil and paper or grease pencil, anything that you can use to help speed up the process. Now, I know I haven't shown you how to actually sequence a shot and decide where to put the camera in what order to do those shots. And that's really that was outside the scope of this course because I just wanted to really focus on the actual camera side of things. But as an extra tip, just thumbnail your ideas. And if you're the only person that needs to see those thumbnails, it only needs to make sense to you. So it doesn't matter how bad you draw, it just needs to get across into your mind what you see. And then you can replay that movie in your mind and go, aha, no, what if I put the camera here? And what if I put the camera there? That will work better. And that's always going to help you out and give you a much better result than if you just start working straight in 3D. My biggest piece of advice would be to make it easier for yourself. The tendency is that you want to show everything all at once. So you've got 4 or 5 characters in a scene, your shot or your short film goes for say 2 minutes, and then I want to show everything and everyone's moving and everyone's talking and it makes it really, really difficult. But if you break it down into smaller parts, it's going to make it a lot easier for everybody involved in the audience as well as you. Because if you're trying to animate 5 characters for 1 minute long, that is actually 5 minutes of animation. But if you do, say, the establishing shot where they're all in it, all the 5 characters, and then you just show the parts of what you want to show after that, then you've actually made it easier for yourself. You don't actually have to do 5 minutes of animation in that one whole short. You're just breaking it down into the smaller shots and you're only working on that specific part. This also has the added advantage of showing you or showing the audience where you want them to look. You can just focus on this character and that character rather than just everything at once. It makes it much more entertaining. So think about when you see it in your mind, what can you cut away to a mid shot, a close-up, a cutaway, a reveal of some description, rather than just showing everything at once for the whole entire time. That is going to make it much more fun to watch, as well as making it easier to animate. Working with files. Now, you can do this in 2 different ways. You can have the one scene file with the camera floating around and jumping and cutting to it in the same scene, or you can break that up into each shot being a separate file. Now, it depends on the project because it might make sense or it might actually be faster to work with everything in the one file and just cut your camera from place to place. But it could also be quicker if you actually separate them out into separate files, or maybe a combination of the two. Say shot 1 and 2 are in one file and then shot 3 and 4 are in the next file. I can't give you specifics on that because it's going to depend on the project that you're putting together. But you can actually start with a template file. So if you've got 10 shots in your short film and you've got 3 of those shots are from a very similar location, you can actually just create one file with the camera in that location and all your assets are in the right place. And you don't need to worry about the rest of the file or the props and whatever. Just build that one template file and then use that template for those 3 shots that you're going to use. That could be a faster way of working. It is totally fine to teleport. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this happens in real world of filming as well, but you have one shot and then you cut to the next. And those locations of the objects or the characters or whatever have shifted a little bit instantly over one frame. Now, this happens in the real world, as I said, but you can also do it in 3D. Although, if you're working in the same scene, you just need to be wary of motion blur. So if you're jumping from here and there, you're going to get blur if you've set up your scene for motion blur. That's just one thing to be wary of. But that happens all the time where You might have your rim lights or whatever, or the character facing this way, then the camera cuts, and all the props and the people are in different spots. This is totally fine. As long as it looks okay on the screen, you can move and shift things around to make it look better. Don't be thinking that you always have to stick in the same physical position. It just needs to look good on the screen. And now a few more things about the actual camera movement. As I've mentioned a couple times before, pay attention to what the camera is actually mounted on and how it moves, or it doesn't move. These are very important things, which I think I've said about 17 times in this course. It's very, very important. Now, another thing about movement, when you're moving the camera, you need to make sure that you have the nice slow ins and slows out, just like the principles of animation, where it's applicable, which is most of the time. If you're pushing a dolly camera along a track, it's going to start in the stop position, and then it's going to speed up, hit its maximum speed, and then slow down. It has a person actually pushing it. It doesn't actually just instantly go fast or in a linear fashion. It slowly speeds up, gets speed, and then slowly comes to a rest. If it's stopping, that is. It might not stop. Who knows? So most of your camera moves will have a slow in and a slow out, especially for rotations as well. That's often one that people forget about. They just go in a linear fashion, unless you're doing, say, a whip pan or something like that, where you want it to be quite fast. And there's also some other exceptions to the rule. So if you're doing a camera shake or some type of special effect, then you might not have any slow out, but most of the time you will. Your camera will slow out of the position that it's moving and then slow into the new position that it's going to get to. Now, there's one more thing I want you to know about the camera movements and the slow ins and slow outs, and that is actually when you're showing the camera moving or stopping in the same shot. If you are cutting from shot to shot within your sequence, and all of those camera moves have all of those camera shots have movement on them, you don't want to slow down or speed up at the start of the shot. That's going to make every shot look weird. You can actually tell where the cuts are going to happen, and this is not what you want. It's not what happens in the real world of filmmaking, because the top and the tail of the shot is always cut off in editing. When you cut to that camera, it's already moving. So how do you do that? Just make sure your tangent handles are already moving on the entrance and the exit of that shot. Now, hopefully you get the difference there between moving the camera with the slow in and the slow out and not slowing down before the cuts. There's a little bit of a distinction there. And the final piece of advice I would like to give you is that remember that when you're composing your shot and things like that, everything is just a guide. So I've mentioned the rule of thirds, which is probably the most popular one, but sometimes the rule of thirds and things, it doesn't fit into what you're trying to do. So what you can do is just make it look as good as possible. So for example, I can see here that actually my eyes aren't at the 1/3 of the way down. They should be here, right? That is 1/3 of the way down. But look at all this headspace. This headspace, it looks totally wrong. So how do I fix that? I just push it there, and that's okay. Now my mouth is along the 1/3 of the way there. So you should be looking at my mouth. It doesn't matter. So why does this look better than a perfectly composed shot? And that is because of the physical limitations of where I am. I'm in this room. The camera is over here. My actual camera doesn't have a zoom lens like the Blender camera can actually, zoom to pretty much negative and positive infinity, or zero in positive infinity. Actually, it probably doesn't. I don't know. I haven't tested that. But you know what I mean. You can zoom that camera. I can't zoom this, and I'm physically limited. So you might also be physically limited in where the characters are on the screen, and they have to be there. So you just got to make the decisions to that best suit that situation. Just remember, all of this stuff is just a guide, and make it look as good as you can. So now you've made it to the end of the course. Yay! Hopefully you found these tips and all the information in the course useful. But most of all, I hope it helps you improve that project idea you've had percolating in the back of your mind. We will add more content about the other aspects of filmmaking in the future, but for now, this should be everything that you need to know about the camera. So good luck, and thanks for watching.